Once upon a time, there was a man who lost his lover to death and was haunted by the ghost of her memory. One night he heard a dark tapping at his chamber door. His madness and sorrow had come to perch above him. A raven, at once a bird and devil, prophet and thing of evil, was vowed to remove his beak from his heart, nevermore. The darkest night watched without feeling, sword in hand, as the fledgling raven clawed its way out of the girl's heart. His eyes shone like moonlight ice, cold and different. He released the transformation, the dark velvet of his cloak, seeming to wrap his body tight for a moment, till he re-emerged in his school uniform. Weariness no longer overtook him when he transformed. The darkness was so close to his heart. Fakir could sense them all around him, the cracked and perfect hearts. All through town did they jingle. It was only when he searched for them, these fractured hearts, released the darkness within, that he could make himself forget the color of Duck's eyes, could escape her words. Why? Why must he think of her when he didn't care? Couldn't even care. He could not bear to face her. Had taken to slipping away so much as heard the whisper of her presence, and searching out cracked hearts, so he could bury his own cracked heart into cold oblivion and darkest night. He stepped out of the art studio and did not see the bespectacled boy hiding in the shadows, watching with an expression of mingled horror and elation. He listened to bells chiming the hour. Rue and Duck talked well into midday. Once Rue, surprised that Duck's human form had worn away, she embraced her friend again, as if to prove to herself that the figure before her was real. Yes, the tale was somber. Yes, the threat of the raven resurrected loomed over them. Yes, she might lose her prince one way or the other, but that did not mean she did not have the small cause for joy. Duck plopped down on a chair gracelessly in surprise and dismay when she heard the reason for Rue and Mythos' errand at Goldtown Town. She figured her jagged pendant around her neck, tried to explain how and at what cost Fakir had wrought this miracle, but not bring herself to voice her worries about the dark-haired boy, even to Rue. The thought was too tangled for Duck to work out, but she knew she could not tell Rue about his cold eyes, the darkness that shadowed him, as if doing so would somehow be a betrayal of Fakir. In the end, she clutched the broken pendant through her blouse, but did not mention it. Rue wished again, as he had ever since Mythos had stated his intention of searching for the raven alone, that he had not jumped to the situation blindly. He had not left her to wait for him helplessly. "Do you think that Drosselmeyer has a hand in this?" the older girl asked, at last venturing to give words to her fear. Duck frowned in thought. "What do you mean?" Rue gestured at Duck vaguely. "You're human again. The raven might have returned. Both the prince and his knight are active secretly. Do all paths lead us back to the same wretched tragedy?" Duck, with her usual intuition and tactlessness, fought the voice that Rue had not. "And you feel trapped?" "As if a part of me has been locked away forever," Rue clarified, her hands clenching in her lap. Duck's brow furrowed in concentration as she considered the girl's words. When she had turned to a duck, she too felt as part of her had been locked away forever. An important part of her, the girl who had laughed with her friends, who had dreamed of Mythos, who always had teased and been teased by Fakir, had been missing. Was that how Rue felt now? Duck wasn't sure she fully understood, but what she could grasp was all that mattered. Rue was unhappy. Duck reached over and touched the girl's tightly clasped hands gently with her own. "Do you want to set it free?" "I can't. I can't let Mythos see the pettiness in my heart." "But he loves you." "It's a fragile, uncertain thing, love." Rue couldn't bring herself to admit outright to Duck that she feared she could lose Mythos' love at any moment, in part because she couldn't understand it. The raven had convinced her all her life that she was imperfect, ugly, unable to be loved. And though she knew it was all a lie, perhaps a part of her still believed him. How could she ever confess such fears, such shortcomings to Mythos? But Duck could understand that too. How worried she had been that Mythos would discover that she was either a duck or Princess Tutu. There was something not quite right with Rue's words. "You loved him even when you found him as the Raven Prince," Duck worked out slowly. "And he loved you even after you found out you were the Princess Corée. Doesn't that make it strong? Does it love mean seeing all someone is and still loving them? Even as he said those last words, Doug heard them echo strangely in her mind, where she had heard that phrase before. As you found all that you truly are. Doug was so lost in her own thoughts he almost missed Rue's response. How could I show that side of myself to him? Vain and selfish, jealous and preening. Ever since we have returned to his kingdom, he has become a fairy tale prince, and I am only human. Perhaps I am something even worse than that, for I almost destroyed him once with my love. But he also saved him with that same love. No matter how hard she tried, Doug could not convince Rue otherwise. In the end, the only thing the two girls could decide on was that they could do nothing more than play normalcy until speaking with the prince in the night. Well, that and lesbian sex. When Ottor saw Rue walking casually towards the girls' locker room, he felt a stab of panic. He barely registered the eager whispers of other students gossiping about the elegant upperclassman, Rue, returning from her ballet tour. Had another story been set into motion all over again? Because of him? Excitement filled through his body at the thought. They at last grasped the power he desired since he had been old enough to read. As he looked on and saw Rue emerge in her dark red practice clothes, Doug trailing behind her, he could not help but wonder, with a touch of unease, how far-reaching had the effects of his offering. Otto tried to push away the tendrils of fear that furled around his heart. Mythos could sense something akin, and not akin to the raven. He scoured the woods surrounding the town all day, but had come out empty-handed. As the sun set, he at last ventured into town to continue his hunting of the ravens into the night. He had walked carefully and silently down the empty streets, looking for a hint of a dark feather, straining at his ear for a raucous cry. And at last he heard it. At the end of a narrow, dark street, he found a building that cast squares of light from its windows on the ground outside. He could hear bustling from within a battered wooden sign that read, "Le Tavern." As Mythos pushed open the door, he heard another spate of calling laughter that had drawn his attention in the first place. Yet when he looked around, all he saw were men and women, and he wondered if he was merely hearing echoes from his own memories. None of the carousing patrons paid any attention to the slight youth in his nondescript worn gray cloak and trousers. Mythos could have left quietly as he entered, but for the unexpected sight of Charon at the bar. The man was slumped over a mug of ale, his eyes shadowed. As surprised and concerned, Mythos walked up to him. It was then he saw the raven, small and vicious-looking, barely a fledgling. It perched on Charon's shoulder. It was ugly and ungainly, covered all over in the charcoal-colored tufts of the nestling. And although it had the soft, merciless beak of a monster, it had the small, bright, curious eyes of a hatchling. No one else seemed to notice it. When Mythos bent down to touch Charon on the shoulder gently, the raven hopped from one foot to the other. The man lifted his head, and Mythos was taken aback by the hollowness in his eyes. His eyes were dull and black and full of despair, as if a raven had come to roost in them. And although Mythos couldn't begin to unravel just what was going on, he knew that his clumsy, voracious bird was at the heart of it. He reached out a hand and plucked it from Charon's shoulder, and stared at a thing that could cause so much pain, and yet looked so fragile in his hands. The creature clawed down with his talons and drew blood, but as Mythos cut the raven nestling in his palm, he realized he could not be able to kill it. After all, he was the prince who had run into a burning building to save Cade's birds, even before he had known he was a prince meant to do such things. Mythos turned once more to the man beside him, whose eyes had finally started to show hints of awareness, as if the raven feathers in them began to part, as if he was at last emerging from a long, tortured dream. Mythos rested one hand again on Charon's shoulder and murmured, "I will take this burden from you, dear friend. Rest now." It was late when Mythos snuck into Rue's room. He wandered the streets aimlessly, unable to bring himself to see her with this proof of his weakness. But at last conceding there was nothing else to do, he made his way to the gold-crowned Fine Arts Academy. Rue woke with a start at the sound of his soft footsteps. "Mythos, what happened?" she asked, alarmed at seeing him clasping his hands to his chest and lying in her desk lap. He looked nervously at her, and at last held out his hands to her. "I could not kill it, though it is a raven," he whispered at last, the weight of his failure heavy on his shoulders. Oh, my prince, she sighed, slipping on a dressing gown that was mostly lace. She embraced him, because this was part of what she had fallen in love with in the first place. Of course, when she saw claw marks all over his fingers, she could not bring herself to forgive the bird so easily. And once it began an incessant clawing racket, she felt murderous enough that some of her anger and irritation showed through. Stupid bird! She cursed under her breath as she made Mythos set the thing down so that he could take care of his hands. Be quiet! She asked that. Eyes wide in horror when, after giving one more petulant caw, it did. Was the Princess of Ravens still that this little monster obeyed her? She looked up anxious, afraid that Mythos might have noticed, might have seen that part of her she wanted to erase. The part that was dark and ugly, full of emotions, and that monster Raven had preyed upon. But Mythos merely smiled at her, as he sighed in relief that he had not heard her words or noticed her expression in the gloom. Duck woke to a quiet but incessant knocking at her door, interspirited with muffled caws. It tugged her away from a dream of green eyes that smiled at her softly before turning icy. A sword made of night lunged at her. When she was finally able to control her eyelids enough to force them open, she was surprised to find it was still pitch black outside. The dream had already started to drift away to cobwebs before a strong wind. The knocking and calling had continued, puzzled and a little worried. She opened the door to find Mythos and Rude at her threshold. Mythos! She exclaimed, still half asleep, too disoriented to process anything more than that. Rue pushed her way into the room and said in a sharp whisper, Duck, let us in before that wretched thing wakes the rest of the dorm. And once she regretted her words, and having lost the poise and serenity she had cultivated to match Mythos' courage and kindness. But at least she had not addressed the bird again, not betrayed how much the raven was in her still. Well, perhaps the situation would prevent her from calling too much attention to herself, for Mythos did not even notice. A stray part of her mind wondered if he had noticed her at all anymore. She viciously, with the thought that it would be better to be loved and overlooked than not loved at all. She could not fathom how she had borne all those years when Mythos had been a heartless doll, only able to give her a reflection of the love she craved in the practiced answers and responses she told him to give. Mythos and Rue explained all, and Duck felt her heart flare with worry when Mythos mentioned Charon. But I just saw him, and there was nothing wrong. Well, that's not true. He don't see himself at all, but I didn't see a raven hunting him. No one else seemed to have noticed either at the tavern. Mythos mused. But you can both see it clearly now, he asked, holding up the indignant bird whose caws Rue had roughly wound in scraps of cotton. I wonder. Duck and I will look for her more with you tomorrow. No. No. The insistent surprisingly came from Duck. No, she repeated. I can't. I have to find Fakir. He doesn't know what's going on, and I'm worried about him. Despite their quizzical looks, Duck could not see any more. She and Fakir had been partners, almost from the start. When he had finally figured out that Princess Tutu had been trying her hardest for the sake of the prince, they worked together. It startled her to realize now that Fakir had been by her side almost from the beginning, as she had such a strange ache thinking that he wasn't beside her now. Duck shook herself out of her thoughts, and to cast the tail end of Rue's request to Mythos. Let me come with you. No, my princess, I want you safe here. And Rue, who had been on the thirds of protesting, looked down and silenced herself. At last Rue and Mythos had departed. Without the bird, Duck had taken one look at it and been moved to pity, offering to care for it until the hatchling could fend for itself. Rue had looked relieved, but Mythos had been worried. Do you think it's a mistake, Tutu, to let this thing live? Duck had considered the angry mess of feathers now safely bundled in her hands. Kindness can never be a mistake, she smiled in response. She found it to her dismay the next morning that it was a mean-spirited, thankless little wretch that bit her fingers as she tried to feed it. But then Duck thought, as she threw open her windows to a flock of multicolored birds, that was how some wild things should be. Despite his anxiety from earlier that day at seeing Rue return to Goldcrown Town, Arthur made himself continue his nightly study of Fakir's manuscript, and spent many hours poring over what alterations to make next. He would not allow her to prevent him from realizing his destiny. Instead, Arthur imagined how Fakir would be jerked around on puppet strings, To the pattern he was so carefully laying out, one singed word at a time. As he painstakingly worked over another page, he did not see the hooded figure that sulked outside his window. He had just finished the page when he heard a heavy, ominous knocking at his door, as if the wood was being struck with the handle of an executioner's blade.